Are we good?
Yeah.
Order. Welcome, Commissioner. Thank you very much for your first appearance in front of this committee since the election. I think this is the first time you've had the chance to come and see us in person.
Right.
So thank you very much for that. We've got a number of questions to go through, and I know that you do have to finish at 4 o'clock sharp. But if you'd like to make an opening statement, you're very welcome to.
That's very kind. I was just going to briefly pick up on 3 things, Chair. Progress we're making in the Met, the policing white paper and the criminal justice system. 3 and a bit years on from starting as Commissioner and picking up after a whole series of scandals, damaged public trust, I'm really proud of what our teams have been doing to make progress in the policing of London. More than 7 out of 10 people trust the police in London. The majority of the rest are uncertain, and a small proportion don't trust the police. That's a rising number, and to have a rising number in today's times when, as most independent surveys say, that the trust in the state, trust in institutions is going down, I'm really proud of what the teams have done on that. Putting crime in 3 baskets, serious violence we've kept driving down. You might have seen in January, we were sort of marking that last year was the lowest per capita homicide rate London has ever seen. That's extraordinary, and you've got cities like Brussels, Berlin and New York, which are about 3 times the rate. So that's really something down to lots of immense hard work by our teams, tackling the most dangerous people and working with partners who divert young people away from violence. Violence against women and girls was a big challenge for us. We've strengthened our work in that area with training and resources and better leadership. And all of our outcome rates, the cases solved, have doubled or tripled, and the gap there was in women's confidence to men's confidence in the Met has been closed as a consequence of that, and we can see more reports coming forward, which is good. And then on volume crime, burglary and vehicle crime are at 5 years lows, and we've turned the corner on things like phone theft, and there's 10,000 fewer victims this year. All whilst dealing with headwinds, 3 headwinds. We've taken 1,500 people out of the organisation, through standards interventions to deal with integrity issues, sort of a scale of intervention not been seen before. Overall, we've had to shrink by 3,300 because of budget pressures created over the last 3 years, and yet we've still gone forward on performance. And thirdly, we've had the increased disruption of an increasing amount of protest to deal with. So my teams have been working extraordinarily hard. The white paper, I think, is a sort of once in generations chance to set policing up for the future. The current policing setup we have in the UK was designed in the early 60s and is well out of date and has had lots of braces and accommodations put around it. There's collaborations, there's national leads, there's national organisations. It's a whole complicated spaghetti that sort of bastardised the sort of version that we previously had, and it's well out of date. And a reset to deal with the challenges of today is overdue, and I welcome the reform white paper the Home Secretary's put together. And also a sense of direction that says policing capability needs to be looked at in the round. It's about police officers, it's about police staff, it's about the technology and the other things that go together to make a good organisation. And a one-dimensional approach, which is just about police officer numbers, is not the right way of doing it. But of course, we do need have the right size organisation for the future. And I'm troubled by our budgets, and I'm sure we'll discuss that. I'm probably most worried, though, of all things about the criminal justice system. It's fantastic we've got the Leveson 1 and 2 reports as a sort of charting a way forward in terms of reform, but I think it's almost impossible to overstate what a parlous state it's in and the risks that presents for communities and victims in a justice system that's going slower and has a weaker grip on offenders that are in that system. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you very much. Well, we'll start the questioning with Joni Reid.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I know that last time you came to this committee it was an entirely different iteration. It was somewhat 3 years ago. So how you've given us a little bit of insight into the progress, the positive progress that you've made in that time. How do you think your priorities have shifted from what they originally were when you were last at this committee? And can I just ask in relation to the white paper, there's a focus now on trying to reorganise so that we have a more responsive neighbourhood police force, and I think I could be wrong about this. Obviously, this has devolved and it's more relevant to Police Scotland. But my sense is that because of the different responsibilities that the Met Police has, that there isn't enough scope to focus on neighbourhood policing in London in particular. Would you agree with that? And do you think the white paper will sufficiently address that?
And we have got a series of questions on the white paper later, so if we could just touch on that briefly so we can cover the more detailed stuff on that later.
So on priorities, 3 years ago I set out we were going to deliver more trust, less crime and high standards, and those top level missions continue, and I've sort of touched on some of the progress being made. So at the headline level it hasn't changed, and also we've consistently looked hard at, say, the serious violence, the violence against women and girls, and the day-to-day volume of crime which affect most people, and making progress on all those fronts. One of the things that has changed when I was having interviews for this job nearly 4 years ago, it wasn't on the basis of make these improvements and have to deal with an organisation that's shrinking rapidly and having its budget squeezed. So that has been a challenge. To add that into the melting pot of leadership decision making has made this much harder. Technology was always on my mind as an issue for reform, and when I was out of policing I did some work with some technology companies. That's now gone further and further up the priority list, because there is no way we're going to meet the challenges of policing modern criminality and dealing with a shrinking organisation unless we can accelerate the way we can deploy modern technologies to speed up our processes and set the front line up with the best tools to be as productive and effective as possible. On the white paper issue, I think, just picking up the hints to be very brief on this point, having a deliberately organised structure with fewer organisations across the country can help neighbourhood policing, because when you've got this complex set of 43 forces and lots of collaborations, you burn lots of capacity making that architecture work. If we organise ourselves well, we can put a bigger proportion of resources into neighbourhoods. The issue in London is slightly different. The pressures of policing a capital city are not properly funded, and that's one of the challenges for us, and our abstractions from policing of neighbourhoods is much greater than I or communities would wish. I'm not talking about our national security responsibilities around counter-terrorism and those issues, because those are in a ring-fenced grant. You'll remember from your time as the Home Secretary Chair, in a ring-fenced grant, so that's almost to one side. It's the day-to-day capital city stretches in London of things like protests and other events which are drawing in more and more resources. I think this year it's going to be about 80,000 officer shifts on those central events. We get some capital city funding, but it's little more than half of what's required for that. This government put a bit more into that pot last year, which was welcome, but we still reckon we're about 180 million short on that. So basically neighbourhood policing and day-to-day policing is paying for the pressures of policing a capital city.
We have got more questions on that as well.
Super.
Jay.
Thank you.
Chris Murray.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in. So you'll have obviously seen Baroness Casey's report previously, where she described the Met as having severe institutional failings, talked about systemic and fundamental problems, and she also described the Met as having initiative-itis, where new initiatives are pushed out from the centre, but they don't quite cut through on the front line of policing. So can I ask then, you've got your new Met for London Phase 2 that's come out with some very laudable, positive sounding objectives. Given what Louise Casey has said, how are you going to make sure that that actually cuts through and translates into reality on the front line of policing?
I'm a great believer in having a plan and trying to stick to it. And in the winds of crises, big operations, challenge in policing, that's difficult, but that's absolutely critical. We've set out from very early in my tenure with one strategy, say, built around those trust, crime and standards objectives, built around 3 areas of reform, which have been about pushing more resources to the local. We talked about community crime fighting, and that's led to less central resources, more in neighbourhood teams, more in local teams dealing with violence against women and girls. Secondly, tackling the culture and standards issues in the organisation assertively. And that's not me doing it to the organisation. The vast majority of officers and staff in the Met want to be in an organisation that feels healthy and they feel supported, and they've all stepped forward. And then thirdly, sorting out the foundational underpinnings which go to our success. And we've continued on that trajectory. So all the new Met London 2 plan is the next set of things on the to-do list to continue in that direction. So a consistent strategy has been absolutely key. And we've changed the balance of central versus local. By having stronger neighbourhood teams with more senior leaders, we've put superintendents in each of the boroughs in London. We're making sure that the issues that a community is seeing in Tower Hamlets or Bromley, which may well be different, are influencing our priorities and resourcing decisions as much as the intelligence picture we can see from the centre. So you get a healthy balance from sort of top down, bottom up, and I think that's delivering the results that you see that I spoke about earlier.
So, thank you for that. I suppose my follow-up question is, you, as you have alluded to, have a challenging financial backdrop which forces prioritisation. So how does the new Met for London guide your prioritisation? Because you've already sort of alluded to the fact that prioritisation is forced upon you by the demands of being a capital city, by the ring fencing of terrorist responsibilities. Is that what drives your prioritisation, or are there other ways that you do it?
So that strategy drives our prioritisation. So for example, our budget pressures last year, we couldn't deal with all of it through efficiencies. Some of it we had to deal with sort of service changes, service cuts, and we started out, well, what are we protecting? We're protecting neighbourhood policing, we're protecting the work we're doing on violence against women and girls. Having strengthened that, we didn't want to weaken it. We put some more resources into some areas, so we made the problem bigger because our priorities said, actually, we need to strengthen our work on some of the street crime issues that has helped us turn that round. So we're protecting these, we're strengthening those, and that made the choices harder. But that's what you do when you're making difficult leadership choices. So we reduced things like there was lots of debate on it in London. You may or may not have picked it up, but around we reduced our provision of front counters because they're rarely used. We stopped having a separate parks policing service. We reduced the size of our mounted sections and dog sections. There were multiple things we did across the organisation because actually we're valuing these things. We've got to make some tough choices. That's what you do when you're pressured. And despite all that, we're continuing to progress in terms of the performance we're delivering for London.
Okay, thank you. And then final question from me is, of those things that you had to cut as a result of the prioritisation, which of those, if you had to pick one that you think was a mistake, or the closest to a mistake, even if you're not willing to admit that, or you wish you hadn't had to do, or that had the negative externalities that you've had to deal with in other ways, what would that be?
The danger of this at the risk of sounding glib, I don't regret any of them. And if you gave me a cheque now that bought me 1,000 more police officers, I wouldn't be recreating those roles. I'd be doing something different with it because of the high priority and the workload, say, in our violence against women and girls teams, or the need to try and reduce the abstractions from neighbourhood policing and tackle those areas. So there are things that are more important to invest in than the things that we've taken resources out of.
Thank you.
Follow up, Jenny Reid.
I just want to go back to this neighbourhood policing because I actually witnessed something this morning, and since you're here, I might as well take the opportunity to ask you if it's a problem in London. So I witnessed a man shoplifting, and we were not talking about one or two goods, but he cleared the whole shelves, put them into his bag, into a trolley, and walked out the shop. And the staff I said, "You're not going to call 999? No, we don't bother anymore." She said, "That's the second time that's happened today." And they brought me down another aisle, and I looked at it. Was the most expensive hair products that they had in the shops, and all of the shelves had been cleared. So that was twice in one day, and they said that they've stopped reporting it because there's no point. So I phoned myself and reported the crime. They were so unfazed by this. I was really quite taken aback. Does that surprise you? Do you think there is? We've talked a lot about an epidemic of shoplifting happening across the country, but do you recognise that as an issue? How would you respond to that?
I recognise a very variable response from shops to shoplifting in their premises. We encourage them all to report it, and the good stores have got really good security regimes and report it. and help us out in ways that I'll come to in a moment. Some stores don't. Our work this year on that, we're close to doubling the number of shoplifting cases we're prosecuting. We're using things like criminal behaviour orders to control the most dangerous offenders. We're working with a group of major stores that are working with a technology company which is using intelligence type software to pull together all the reports and across the video, the CCTV videos, identify series, so we could say, well, that person's done those 20 thefts and go after that person, and they get a bigger sentence, and that controls it. So we've got some really
not happening.
So we've got some really good. So we've got some really good examples. So we're determined to bear down on this. So we're nearly doubling the amount of cases we're prosecuting. We've been tackling some of the organised crime behind it, such as how we've seen goods being stolen from mainstream supermarkets being resold in corner shops and an industry there, and we've closed down lots of corner shops as a consequence. But I have challenged some parts of the retail sector to do better. Some of them don't report anything. If we go there, they don't give us the CCTV of the crime. They won't give us any statements. They don't allow their staff to have time to do statements, and they don't pay their staff to go to court to give evidence, and that's for me unacceptable. Meanwhile, some of the fantastic national chains like Boots would be one example, are really they're really serious about it normally. So that's really out of character for them. Across the country they report it, and they're very good normally.
Thank you. Margaret Malone.
Yeah, following on from what my colleague said, I represent an outer London borough, and the shoplifting is prolific in my seat. I'm very pleased that the BCU, Borough Commander, has really stepped up and done a lot of work. Yeah. But I asked the Home Secretary this, and I think we run out of time, but I was just wondering, because neighbourhood policing means everything to the people that I represent. But I think if the police are constantly abstracted out of the areas, it's a huge problem. And I just wonder what you see the way forward. I mean, what my colleague just said, the shops are cleared regularly all round my seat. So the local BCU are responding to that. So I think the AI will be great. So I was called to, I was on my way into Westminster yesterday, and I was called into a local coffee shop at a station, and his door was kicked in. The police turned up. They looked at the CCTV, but that, because they didn't know who that was. But if you use AI going forward and you're doing the CBOs and you're very proactive, but, when we cut to it, it's all, I personally feel, having a named neighbourhood, a name that you can reach out to in the area, it's not going to be any good if you're abstracted into London on a very regular basis. And I just wonder what you think the solution is.
So thank you for that. So firstly, a case like the one you talk about, we're already using facial recognition software. So the public debate tends to be about live facial recognition use in public, and we may talk about that later, I don't know. But reactive use, so last time I checked, the CCTV we get of offenders, such as a case like that, we're able to identify pretty much straight away about 40% of the offenders because they're already in our systems because we've come across them before. So that's really powerful, which is why we need the retailers and others to produce the CCTV and give it to us to be able to do that. Our neighbourhood policing abstractions are bigger than I would want. I don't dispute that. And I touched on that earlier. We are not funded to dealing with the growing pressures of policing a capital city. As I say, probably the best part of 80,000 days of policing protests over the last year. I've got some numbers here. I think it's about 500. We've had to manage them, 500 protests managed centrally. Sometimes we have thousands of officers on these. That we don't have an extra box to open for that, and that's coming from across the Met. We've worked hard to reduce the impact on neighbourhoods over the last couple of years. We're taking a bigger proportion of those resources now from other parts of the organisation, but most of our police resources are in local policing, serving communities, and so it's inevitably tips that way. If the 180 million gap for policing capital city was closed, we could massively bring down that abstraction rate. It's fantastic that despite those distractions, we're arresting 1,000 people more a month at the moment in London, and a lot of that work has been done by those neighbourhood teams. They're doing fantastic work there. I'm frustrated, you're frustrated, they're there 3 or 4 days a week rather than 5 days a week, but they are doing fantastic work and they're really making a difference.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Kohler.
Thank you. Before I ask the question I was going to ask, I want to go back to neighbourhood policing. In Merton, we've lost both our front counters in Wimbledon Police Station and Mitcham Police Station. Why do you think that front counters, police stations aren't important to neighbourhood policing?
So let's talk about sort of separate out police stations, police bases and the actual front counter. In terms of front counters, they are rarely used in much of London. And the arrangements that we've gone to in London are similar, in some cases more generous than what you'll see in forces around the country who've gone here over the last 10 years. The sort of closures of front counters we've done are counters that maybe have 2 people in a day come in to report a crime or something like that. They're very, very, very low usage, and that's a very expensive way of dealing with that. And actually, if you speak to communities, and picking up the point made last, what people want most is the patrol in their area, and I'd rather be cutting the front counters that almost nobody uses than the patrol on the streets. In terms of buildings and presence, clearly it's important to have officers distributed across London. It's also important to have neighbourhood policing teams close to their patch. In an ideal world, you want them to be able to walk out their base and be on their patch with maybe a 20-minute walk. Of the sort of best part of 700 wards in London, there's over 100 we can't do that in, which I'm disappointed in. We recently published a new estate strategy, which is unaffordable, but it's deliberately put out there to challenge sort of local and national government about funding the infrastructure of policing properly, because we have a large part of our estate is suboptimal, and the amount of money we need to spend just to keep our existing buildings working is not available. So our budget doesn't even cover keeping sensible standards in the existing buildings. When we look at other challenges, such as wanting to put bases for neighbourhood teams closer to communities, or needing to meet the challenge of the electrification of vehicle fleets, which has a big impact for policing because we have to put massive charging infrastructures in place. And this isn't about chasing any green targets, this is simply following the speed of the market change. The sort of multiple billions we need to spend on estates over the next few years we don't have, and that's the challenge. One way to try and make some progress on that, despite the budgets, is if partners can help us with at low rates sharing other buildings in communities that might help us with the neighbourhood team part of that. I'm looking to do it. So I'm trying to stretch ourselves as far as we can do on that. But absolutely we should have neighbourhood teams based in and close to the community. The evidence is that people you'd rather have them on the streets tackling issues than in a front counter doing very little.
Wimbledon Police Station has far more than 2 visitors a day, and that's been closed. But are you having discussions with councils about sharing premises?
Yes.
Are you discussing that with Merton Council?
We're doing it across London, and we're coordinating it with City Hall. I can't remember the individual conversations with each council, but that's the intent.
Okay. This committee was deeply shocked by the Panorama programme in Charing Cross Station, as I'm sure you were.
Yes.
Before I ask you what you've done about it, why didn't the Met know about it already? How could this happen without the Met knowing about it?
So the Met having long-term issues on standards is not news, and I've been very clear about our determination to tackle that. We have, as I said at the start, we've removed 1,500 people from the organisation because of standards issues, whether that's through vetting, whether that's through misconduct investigations, etc. That's well over 3 times the pre-existing rate. It's beyond anything that's ever been done before. One of the areas I've had to put more resources into is our professional standards environment. That has had a big positive effect on the organisation, but we're not through it yet, and there are still pockets in the organisation we're identifying where people are hunkering down despite the efforts of our team, and that's what you would expect. If I just describe the efforts that we've done so far, I think it's easiest to describe the strategy in 3 parts. Firstly, tightening the front door. So the first thing is, what's your vetting like at point of entry, and it was 2 weeks, and we've now sort of more than doubled the failure rate at the front door through more intrusive checks and more assertive decision making. So you sort of get the front door tighter, and there's more work we're doing going forwards, acquiring new social media monitoring tools and other things. Secondly, you encourage more reporting and get more vigorous in responding to allegations in the organisation. As I said earlier, our good people want to be in a good organisation. We've got 3 times as much reporting, and that's helped generate people leaving the organisation. But thirdly, you have to look at all the material you already have and look back at legacy issues. Legacy information about people that hasn't been dealt with, where if you look back at all the things you know about John Smith, it's very obvious he shouldn't be a police officer. And that's why we pushed for changes in vetting regulations, and which have eventually been achieved. And through that combination of efforts, we've had that effect. We are making good progress to being as robust as you could possibly be, but we're still finding issues. We found an issue on one of our BCUs with a group of leaders who were involved in a sort of a criminal conspiracy, and they've all been arrested and suspended. We had the case at Panorama unfurled for us, and there's other things we're finding. So we're going to keep turning these cases up, and we're going to keep getting there. There'll be fewer and fewer of them, but an organisation that is ruthlessly determined about its integrity and its reputation, and is coming from a difficult place, this is what you'll see on a regular basis.
Were you aware that there were problems in Charing Cross before the Panorama programme? Were you aware of any problems, or was it a difficult station? Was it known as having problems?
There wasn't a particular strand of information about that misconduct. I think when you watch the programme, you see a group of people in a very closed environment in custody, and you see a small number of them behaving in a really toxic way, and other people afraid to challenge them. It's a really troubling thing to see, and some of the attitudes they displayed were vile. So that hadn't been surfaced. I've just come from a leadership summit. We've been doing some work with our top 700 leaders about how we get more intrusive as a leadership team, what can be done differently. So at some point in the future that would have been surfaced, but as I say, we're slowly working through the organisation. The biggest doubling down on standards that policing has ever seen in this country by a long way. We're a large part of the way through it, but we're not finished. But meanwhile, we've got the majority of our people are fabulous people who are stepping forwards and making a difference.
You've previously talked about custody staff wearing body-worn cameras. Has that developed, that idea?
So I think we put in the letter back to you when you wrote to us when that happened about sort of the ideas we were exploring. That was a long list of ideas. That's one we decided not to do. We've come to the conclusion the CCTV coverage in custody is so close to ubiquitous that actually body-worn videos wouldn't actually add much to that environment. And we've identified 1 or 2 black spots in corridor corners and things in custody blocks that we're closing down through CCTV rather than body-worn video.
Can I just bring Chris Murray in very quickly?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The officers in the Charing Cross Panorama should never have been police officers, and there's really clear evidence of people who have passed vetting who should never have been police officers. What can you tell us about what you're doing to do proper checks on people with allegations of sexual assault, with complaints about inappropriate and sexual behaviour, to make sure that they're taken out of the police?
You can see cases that have come to the surface and people that we've been removing from the Met in recent years where there was a warning sign when they came into the organisation, they were given the benefit of the doubt. You can see cases of that, and those were poor decisions. Sometimes people under pressure for recruitment numbers, and they shouldn't have been put under that pressure. Those are poor decisions that were made. As I say, one of the things we now track that wasn't routinely tracked before is the sort of vetting failure rate at the point of entry, and that's now bouncing around, I think, about 10 or 11%. It was a lot lower previously. So we're tracking that. The sort of things that we're doing differently, we've put a much clearer set of instructions in terms of guidance to our decision makers on vetting that is clearer and more assertive. We're doing a whole range we're doing more detailed checks when people come into the organisation, and we're investing constantly in sort of new tools. So as I say, this year we're rolling out new social media tools that will help get a more penetrating view of someone's social media history. But vetting isn't just about that initial moment, it's also ongoing. So we're now routinely washing officers' details against Police National Computer, other intelligence databases. So if something new comes up that's elsewhere in the land of data, in the Met or elsewhere, making sure we're spotting that very, very early on.
So women in London can have confidence in you that you're checking the allegations of sexual assault on police officers before they phone 999. That is taking place across all police.
So at the point of entry and all the way through, we are building a system that's as robust and determined as it possibly can be. That's why you've got, say, 1,500 people have left the organisation. Another example of that on the sort of the misogyny and sexual assaults in so many of these cases that have led to officers leaving the organisation are appalling and disgraceful and embarrassing for the service. One of the things I did at sort of day one, we sort of did what we called Operation Onyx. So earlier on I spoke about strategy, which was tighten the front door, going forward, get better at responding to allegations, encourage more, but look backwards at the data. One of the look backwards was every sexually related allegation that had been made in the organisation for a decade, ranging from an allegation of inappropriate comment all the way through to sexual assaults and sort of horrific allegations. Clearly there were things that hadn't been proven because these people were still in the organisation. Of those 1,600 that look back, nearly 400 of them now left the organisation as a consequence of that. So that shows a more assertive approach. That's one example.
Cola.
The effects this has on usable manpower. In November 2022, you said 500 officers were suspended or on restricted duties due to allegations of misconduct. Another 3,000 were not deployable because of health, physical or mental health issues. That's what 3,500 people, officers were then not deployable. What are the figures now?
I'd have to come back to you on those, but sort of
Is it improving or
the suspended and restricted, I'm pretty sure are lower, but I'd have to come back on those. We mustn't, the resource implications mustn't be the reason for not suspending somebody. Clearly, that would be those are the sort of mistakes that have been made in the past where that's the road to hell really, to start to let that influence those decisions. But those numbers are coming down. I'm pretty sure. In terms of people with health issues and adjusted duties, over the last 18 months we've been working through a process of making sure we have several thousand jobs in police officer jobs in the Met where people with restrictions can make 100% contribution. Not every job requires you to be charging around on the streets confronting dangerous people. So we're doing a better job of aligning people's restrictions to those skills. And we're also asking more of our occupational health experts, and we are discovering that a minority of individuals have been playing the system and should be fully fit and back out at work, and that's happening as well. And the majority are being found the right roles for them. So we're dealing with that, so it's having a minimal impact on operational policing.
Thank you. I was hoping you'd reassure me more, because this is a real issue in 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago when you were asked. I was hoping you'd tell me, yes, we're getting rid of people quickly, not many are on restricted duties, waiting that process. We're addressing the issue of those with mental and physical problems. I thought you'd be really on top of that. The figure was 3,500 back in November 22, and now we're actually addressing it, and I've got evidence we're doing so. But you seem somewhat vague whether the number's gone up or down.
I just don't have those numbers in front of me. I can write back to you on it. We are there have been some reductions in those numbers, but as we get, it's not just what the numbers are in those with restrictions, because some of these are officers who are damaged through the course of their work. There's a dangerous implication in your question that we just cast them aside and say, good to us anymore. And I'm sure that's not what you meant.
Ones who are not properly deployable.
That
sounds like.
But you might not be properly deployable because you're damaged from what you've dealt with in policing, whether psychologically or physically damaged. And so we shouldn't be casting them aside deliberately, but we should be businesslike and finding them a role where they can fully contribute, and that's what we're doing. So a restriction doesn't necessarily mean you're not fully contributing. You need to match the restriction to the nature of the role. That's the important point.
I see that, but can we have figures on the ones which aren't
so we're
being used productively?
And we're in a big redeployment in the organisation. If you know people in policing, you'll probably hear that from colleagues. But we're making sure that alignment is taking place. We're also finding out the minority who are abusing those adjusted duties process and actually can be fully fit and dealing with that and getting them back to work. I'll get you the detail on the suspended and restricted officers for misconduct reasons, but we're not going to try and reduce that just for resource convenience for obvious reasons.
Thank you.
Lewis Atkinson.
Thank you. Can I just finish off on I think the standards piece, Commissioner, in terms of just thinking about the link between the government's proposals around licence to practice and how your response to those proposals, but particularly as far as you see that maybe linking in how you do standards work in the future.
So I think the potential benefits of a licence to practice are more about increasing the positive than dealing with the negative problem. So, it's fairly obvious that a licence to practice, you need to be an officer with integrity. That's it's not a radical proposal, and so we have to get more robust to put that in place. A licence to practice for the future, though, for a profession is people who are responsible for their own development. They're keeping their skills and their knowledge up to date. They're maintaining the qualifications they have as maybe detectives or response officers, neighbourhood officers, firearms officers, etc. And there's an expectation, like you have in other professions, in terms of maintaining and developing those skills, which is shared between the individual and the organisation. I think the benefits, I think, are obvious in terms of a more professional and better police service, and where the officers and staff within it feel more valued. The risks, if we do it wrong, is you create something so bureaucratic it sucks lots of capacity away from the front line. That's not a way not to do it, reason not to do it, but we could go into it carefully.
Yeah. So it would contribute to building a positive culture as opposed to tackling a negative culture.
Exactly that.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, you made a number of changes to the parliamentary and diplomatic command. Can you just tell us to assess to what extent the culture there has changed?
So it's been very very positive. There's been a whole range of changes from leadership all the way through. When you get underneath cultural issues, some of it comes down to some real basics. So, for example, the operating model was designed around cost, not around supervision and management and standards. So over many years, reasonable pressure from Parliament to reduce the cost of it had led to shifts and duties being organised just to do the bare minimum in terms of covering required posts. But if you end up with everyone on different shifts, starting and finishing at different times, starting for different places, and you spend the bare minimum on leadership, you end up with people who aren't in teams and aren't supervised. So we've had to reset the operating model, and the parliamentary authorities have been supportive in that process, so that you've got teams more working together, you've got more supervision. We've also there wasn't enough rotation, so you risk creating stagnant teams, and we've done some of that. Armed commands, the diversity balance tends to be different in them to elsewhere, and we've done some special work to break down the barriers to entry for women officers, and that's having a big effect in terms of changing the diversity in the mix. And that was actually led by a couple of sergeants and inspector from Parliamentary Diplomatic Protection, who were male officers. The three of them, I remember saying to me, look, we've got daughters, we're not proud of this, we want to fix it. And they've created a scheme which has familiarised and encouraged women officers to join. That's changing the balance. When I look at some of the key data around it, such as they used to have higher rates of conduct cases, etc. Those rates are much lower and much more comparable with us. So I can see the effects of the change that are taking place.
Thank you. Moving on, you've previously called for changes in the accountability regime for firearms officers, and clearly the government proposed some of those towards the end of last year. Can you give us your view about the changes that have been proposed?
So it was an accountability review commissioned when Suella Braverman was Home Secretary. It reported when James Cleverly was Home Secretary, and Yvette Cooper as Home Secretary then announced in Parliament that she was going to act on it and deliver those recommendations. Several of them have been acted upon in terms of, one example would be anonymity. Other parts of it are still to be acted on. Two of the most critical ones are relating to the alignment of thresholds for assessing officers' conduct in use of force situations. So at the moment there are 3 thresholds. Imagine in your workplace being held to 3 different thresholds by 3 different processes. One is the criminal threshold, one is the inquest threshold, and one is the misconduct threshold. And because they're all different and they have to get dealt with sequentially, you end up with cases where officers and the families of those they confronted, the whole process, it takes too long. We had an officer who was finally out of that process, found with nothing wanting, with a misconduct hearing that took place last autumn, about 9 years and 10 months after he shot somebody dead. And having met him, the effect of that on him and his family is just awful. And he went to work to do his job to protect the public of London and had to make a really difficult split-second decision. That intent from government is good and welcome. The regulatory change on conduct regulations, because it's regulatory rather than primary legislation, can be done quite speedily, and the Home Office have started work on that, and I hope that's going to be done in a very small number of months. The change to get coronial thresholds realigned to criminal thresholds, which they used to be till about 5 years ago, to get that re-established is a primary legislation change which the Ministry of Justice is leading on, and I hope that appears in a bill quite soon, because until those things are aligned, officers are still, I think, being put in unreasonable jeopardy.
Thanks. And in terms of firearm officer recruitment and retention, do you feel like, due to the regulatory environment, but perhaps other considerations as well, is the Met now in a position to be able to attract and retain the firearms officers that it needs to keep London safe?
Yeah, it was very fragile. It's not perfect, but it's a lot less fragile than it was, and the recruiting is going in the right direction. And I think they have seen that, they've recognised that government and Parliament are looking to fix these issues, and that is appreciated, because we do put them in an extraordinary position, don't we, to be asked to do that as part of your daily work and make a decision that is literally life and death, and and you expect, and it's only proper that should be really seriously scrutinised, but we ought to be able to find a way where that's done within 10 months maybe rather than 10 years. That's the challenge, and they are so professional and careful. We are deploying 4,000 firearms deployments a year in London. We're arresting 1,600 people on those operations. We're seizing about 1,000 weapons, and we're firing shots once or twice a year. That shows the degree of care and professionalism, and it's those officers who are a big part of driving down lethal barrel discharges in London, which is by taking the offenders and the weapons off the streets, which is part of us having the lowest homicide rate ever. We put them in those situations to make those decisions. They deserve a scrutiny process which is speedy and has one hurdle in it, not one that goes on this Byzantine multi-year journey.
Thank you.
El Ribiera-Addy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. Do you accept the conclusions of Dr. Shireen Daniels' report on racism in the Met? She described the Met as having discrimination baked into its institutional design.
So we will take challenge from all sorts of different perspectives, and I'm grateful for Dr. Daniels' report. We're committed to a police service that is inclusive and anti-discrimination, and Dr. Daniels has given us a perspective on that which is helpful and insightful. One of the things that's most powerful to me from it is that it resonated particularly with some of our black officers and staff and their perspective within the organisation. That's a useful reflection. As we look at the next stage of our plans on culture, and particularly being an inclusive anti-racist organisation, we're taking account of her recommendations. The thing that these areas get more and more contentious, don't they, in the middle of more and more polarised debate and culture wars. I think there are 3 reasons that policing has to remain committed to inclusion and anti-racism. Firstly, our sort of founding vision for policing in this country and in London was about policing by consent. That has an implication about relationships with communities, and we police a sort of a complex, diverse, globally connected city. Secondly, the law gives us all sorts of duties about fairness and encouraging sort of equal opportunity and diversity. And thirdly, there is lots of good evidence from the sort of MBA type world in terms of studying healthy or good organisations that the best organisations are inclusive. Because if you're inclusive, you make the best of all the talent you've got, and you have the ability then to understand and connect to the world. If you're monocultural, you miss that opportunity, and particularly policing a city as complex as London, that's critical. So her insights are something that we're taking account of as we build the next stage of our plans.
And the Met said that it would reflect on what she had found. And do you recognise the picture that she paints of the Met in her report?
It's not everyone has the same perspective, do they? But I'm not going to sort of criticise it. I'm a sort of white 60-year-old bloke. I've got sort of young black colleagues who have a different perspective and experience in the organisation. And if Shireen is playing some of that back, I've got to listen to that. So I think it's a valuable insight. Sort of, we're not all going to see the world the same way, but I think hearing other people's insights is part of being an effective organisation, and taking account of that in our plans going forward is important.
So, following on from that, what actions have you taken personally to address the issues that she raised in the report?
So, as she says in her report, she said if you rush into an action plan on the back of this, you're missing the point. So we haven't done that. We are, as I've said sort of earlier, we talked a lot about standards. There's an awful lot of work we're doing on standards and culture more generally. Over the last 3 years, we've done a lot of work around sort of training around culture and diversity. We've looked at issues, particular issues that go to the operational effect about how we conduct stop and search, a vital and effective tool, but needs to be done with respect and courtesy, as well as for good, effective operational reasons. We've looked at issues like victim blaming language. We've looked at leadership skills. As I said earlier, I've just come from a leadership summit where we're talking about what the top 700 leaders in the organisation can do on culture. So we have a momentum in terms of improving the organisation, which is what's borne out in our performance figures and the increasing trust of London. I think it's interesting in those trust figures that trust in the Met has risen. The trust of those communities with the lowest trust in the Met, the LGBT plus community and the black community, has risen fastest. So that gap is closing. It's not closed, but I'm pleased it's going in the right direction.
Yeah. It's not the first report over many years to have found similar findings, and we've just touched on the Casey review earlier, and that specifically found institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia. After it was published, you promised a 2-year follow-up to assess any progress, and that was due in March 2025, but it hasn't really materialised. So could you tell us why that is, and if there are any plans to do that?
So, sorry, but you've obviously missed the announcement. So Dr. Gillian Fairfield is doing the follow-up review on behalf of the Mayor and myself, and she started about 6 weeks ago, and in fact I was with her this morning.
Okay, so it's another review?
So no, it's not. It's So you were saying, why haven't you done the review, and then you're criticising it for being another review. That seems slightly odd.
No, you were saying that you would a 2-year follow-up and an assessment, I suppose, showing us where you had moved forward. I think the worry amongst some communities that it is just going to be another assessment as opposed to an action plan.
So I'm responsible for the actions and the action plans in the organisation. Gillian Fairfield, that piece of work, it's not another review in the same way as the Casey one. Louise Casey said in her recommendations that 2 years in, okay, so we're doing it 2.5 years later, we decided that was a better timing, but two years in, it would make sense to have a checkpoint. She was quite clear that all the issues that we're dealing with wouldn't have been resolved in that period of time, but there should be a checkpoint on progress made and to give opinions on what is the highest priorities going forward. So obviously we have a plan going forward in terms of what we've decided is most important and how we see ourselves making more progress, and I've talked about how we're making progress on trust and confidence already. I imagine Gillian Fairfield will find that we've made progress. She'll probably like some of our plans going forward, and she'll probably have ideas on things we could do differently. That's going to be welcome.
Okay. And do you accept that the Metropolitan Police has gone through a period of being institutionally racist, sexist and homophobic?
So I think we've had this debate previously. It's not the language I choose to use. I've been really clear that there are systemic issues which go to the culture in the organisation, the failings, and we've touched on some of those earlier on, and we're tackling those systemic issues. This isn't just about a few individuals, it's about how an organisation behaves, how it's organised and how effective it is at serving London. I'm proud of the progress we're making on dealing with those. We wouldn't be reducing violence, we wouldn't be increasing the cases we're solving on violence against women and girls, we wouldn't be reducing street crime, we wouldn't be increasing trust, we wouldn't have some of the highest levels of confidence of the city forces in this country in terms of local policing. We wouldn't be increasing faster the confidence, the trust of those groups that have lowest policing in London if we weren't making progress. But this is not something that you do in a couple of years. This is a long-term journey, but I'm proud of the progress our teams are making.
In terms of the confidence of victims, we can see that in the 12 months to September 2025, 63% of victims were saying that they were satisfied with the Met overall in the service they provided. What are you doing to ensure that all victims, including those with protected characteristics, have the same satisfactory experience?
So we definitely see that as a priority going forward to improve that. There's a piece of work which has just started testing on one of our BCUs on the South East, which will be rolling out over the course of the next year. We have at the moment too complex a process from a crime initially being reported through the different handoffs to different people all the way through to an investigator, and that takes too long and too often leave victims disappointed with that experience. So we've got a new approach we're taking which will accelerate that, so victims get much clearer understanding of where their case is going much sooner in that process. It started a week ago. I had an update on it on Monday, but the first week, it's only a week, but the first week it looks like something that's going to work and make a difference on that.
Okay. So you talked about things going up slightly in certain communities, but that points to the fact that levels of trust were found to be markedly lower in those from black and mixed ethnic backgrounds and people from LGBT plus communities. And they cited over-criminalisation, under-protection, institutional racism, sexism and homophobia again, as well as other prejudices as being the reasons why they have low trust in the police. And I want to understand, especially since you don't recognise the institutional failings, what work is being done to understand why those levels of trust are low and address them directly.
So, firstly, I think the picture is more nuanced and complex than the question suggests. So, when you look at London's diversity and different levels of trust in the police and different levels of confidence in the policing of your area, the pattern is quite varied. So, for example, Asian communities have higher levels of trust and confidence in the police than the average. London's white communities have high levels of trust but low levels of confidence than average. Black communities have low levels of trust but actually higher levels of confidence than average in the effectiveness of policing of their area. So I think just focusing on one dimension pretends this is a binary issue, and it's much more complex than that in the sort of given, which is perhaps not surprising given the nature of London's communities and the history, and some of that history is nothing to do with the police. Some of that history is down to policing and some of the things we've got wrong in the past and sometimes still do today. When we look,
I'm confused. You said it's got nothing to do with the police, but it's got to do with what you've got wrong in the past.
I didn't say that. I said some of those differences will be around environmental factors, community factors that are nothing to do with the police. Some of them will be about things the police have got wrong in the past or today. So I'm just saying there's a mix of factors behind it. That's the only point I'm making. So in terms of so that requires specific solutions to specific parts of this. So in terms of trust with black communities, one example of the work we've done would be the significance of stop and search in that relationship is enormous over the years. You can go back to the 1980s. Here we have something which is a very, very effective operational tool which reduces crime, but if done badly, can damage trust and confidence. And so we spent a lot of time working with people from the community, looking at what would a stop and search charter look like, what are the commitments the community want from us beyond our legal obligations that will make a difference. And that's published, and that's featuring in our training for how we operate with stop and search. That's one example of the sort of changes we're making. There are other examples in terms of community scrutiny groups where there are panels in boroughs who can look over stop and search and body-worn video of taser incidents and scrutinise and challenge policing on our tactics. So there's multiple strands of work we're doing to drive those improvements. But as I say, the fact that the trust of black communities is growing fastest is a positive.
I'm very conscious of time. We've got quite a few other topics to cover. Paul Kohler wants to come in with a quick follow-up.
Thank you. Very quickly on the issue of victim satisfaction, what role do you think restorative justice has to play in victim satisfaction, and what role should the police have in facilitating that process?
So I think out-of-court disposals, of which that would be one part of it, have potentially a big role for the future. Previous work across the country on out-of-court disposals finds that on the right cases they can deliver higher victim satisfaction because it's dealt with quickly, you haven't got the long legal process of a court, and if it's not going to be for the most serious crimes, but for many crimes that is appropriate. At the moment, there is not a good national system for restorative justice. The last government paused partway through resetting out-of-court disposals. We currently have a setup where cases don't count as solved if they're solved outside the court process, which is, I think, a disincentive to use those tactics. So I think it's a missing opportunity. And if you look at the Leveson review in terms of the clogged justice system, one of the things he recommends is greater use of out-of-court disposals. And I do think that's a missed opportunity at the moment. And I know the government is considering it as part of the Leveson recommendations.
Very quickly, because I haven't got long, but whenever I talk to police officers about restorative justice, they always talk about out-of-court disposals as if they're synonyms. Restorative justice is not just about out-of-court disposals. That is understood by the police, is it not?
It is. It's just one way you would do an out-of-court disposal. There are other ways, just in terms of warnings, restorative justice, training programs. There's a whole range of different ways you might do it. One of the issues there is who is going to manage these processes? Is it probation? Is it policing? Is it third sector? How's that going to be funded? But it's not. I see restorative justice as a subset of out-of-court disposals. That's all I'm saying.
I'm going to move on to, we've already touched on neighbourhood policing, but Margaret Mullane has some specific questions.
46% of Londoners feel the Met do a good job. So how successful do you think you've been to tackle the neighbourhood crime? And I'm thinking of focusing on shoplifting, shops, car thefts, tool thefts. How do you think that you've done?
So I say we're making progress. There's definitely more to do. So 46% say a good or very good job in their local area. 81% if you add in fair. So fair, good and very good is 81%, which I know given the resource stretch, etc., I think our teams are doing well. Our data on that tends to be, and there's different metrics around that, tends to be the best of the city forces in this country. So I think we're doing well on those benchmarks, but you would want it to be higher. The work we're doing, so arresting 1,000 people more a month, doubling the number of shoplifting cases we're prosecuting. So there's going to be at least 10,000 fewer victims of phone theft this year compared to last year with all the operations the teams are doing. The extra work against antisocial behaviour and drugs, the criminal behaviour orders. There's an enormous amount of work those teams are doing. So I'm proud of the progress we're making, but there is definitely more to do. And If I had more resources, a chunk of it would be in neighbourhood policing.
So what do you think that you could do to sort of increase people's confidence in the Met? Because a lot of people in my seat that I speak to that have been victims of crime don't bother to report that. So the kind of percentages and what we're all kind of quoting here today, that might not be a true reflection on the amount of crime, because if it is the kind of, you've had your car stolen, and okay, right, here's your number, here's your crime reference, ring your insurance. So do you think then, on that basis, that perhaps locally you shouldn't be dealing with it, it should go to a national level because it's sometimes serious crime?
So I think the underreport, I think you can overstate the underreporting if that's not a confusing phrase. I think we are drawing the reporting through for most types of crime. Things like shoplifting will never be fully reported, but I think things like burglary, because of insurance reasons, are reported. And when I look at the impact we're having on crime, I also look at other people's data. So in terms of violence, there are fewer people turning up at casualties injured through violence, for example. You can look at things like footfall. So the work we've been doing on street crime, I'm encouraged by the fact that in December, the footfall in Westminster in the West End was up compared to the previous year. So those sorts of data points, casualty, footfall, give a sense of the public's sense of safety and them noticing.
Could that be that you focused on the West End because of the phone thefts, and then the other parts of London, the outer London boroughs, don't quite have that presence?
So it could be that, but it's not. So, for example, in our winter plans that we had, I'm going to see if I can find it quickly. We had, I think, 18 town centres, 18 locations in London, which we could see from previous years were the most likely areas to be targeted with crime at that time of year, and we put extra patrols and plans in all of those areas. And I'm trying to do this from memory, I may be slightly out, but it was 15 or 20% less crime in those areas this year compared to the previous year. So by being focused, you can have an effect. And of course, the West End is bound to be one of those, but it wasn't the only one, because there are town centres across London, for example, that in the run up to Christmas, people socialising more, people shopping more. They are places people want to feel safe and enjoy themselves, and therefore they're places criminals will target if we don't put extra attention to them. And that's what we did, and that's how we deliver lower crime this year compared to last year.
Just very quickly on the phone theft, so you still feel that local forces should do that, because we had a presentation in Parliament from the Met, and it's organised crime behind it. So you don't think that should go to a national level. You still think it should be local.
It's bound to be some of both. So if you look at phone theft, you've got people on the street stealing them. Some of those are teenagers who know they can make some quick money out of it. Some of it's, so that's not really organised. Some of it's more organised. You'll get organised. We've had some organised pickpocketing gangs coming from Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Then you've got people who are acting as handlers. Some of them are reselling them in London. Some of them are then passing them on to third parties who are exporting them internationally. And you've got the whole international trade. So we've been working on operations across that spectrum. At the top end of that, we've been dealing with some organised crime groups based in London, and working with National Crime Agency to connect to law enforcement in China and other countries where they're being exported to. So you need to join the whole piece together. It's not going to be about national or local. It's bound to be about how you join all that together across the system. You might have seen in the press last autumn, we charged one gang who were exporting 30 to 40,000 stolen mobile phones a year to China. Extraordinary operation. We've got we're currently doing some another intensification period, and we're taking out more handling gangs at the moment, and you'll see some press stuff on that in due course. It's a really determined effort, and that's why there's 10,000 fewer victims in London. The key question on this, which I think on the Technology Committee in Parliament picked up on, was how do you design this out? And there will always be a market in this with the value of these phones second hand. Most of us are, I think, old enough to remember car radios being stolen, and then the car industry redesigned that, and the radio is so integrated to the dashboard you couldn't possibly steal a car radio anymore. The equivalent with mobile phones is through the operating systems, the iOS Apple operating system and the Google Android operating system. If you had your phone stolen, you were able to deactivate that. So that was a brick forever and wasn't able to be reconverted into a usable phone. That would completely kill the second-hand value. There'd be a couple of parts in the phone, maybe the screen and the cameras, but it would be pretty useless. And that would have a big effect. And it's taken a long time, but the conversations with Google and Apple are getting more constructive on that. And as a way to completely reset it and get us out of this cycle where there's a lot of money to be made exporting tens of thousands of phones from European cities to Africa and China.
We have started, we did our call for evidence last week on our inquiry on the role organised crime plays in neighbourhood crime, organised criminality in neighbourhood crime. So I'm sure we'll welcome some evidence from...
We've got buckets of evidence to send you,
That's what
Chair.
we would like to have. We're going to move on now. So Joe White's got some questions on the police reform white paper and then some questions on policing of protest. So Joe.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You've already spoken about it, but what do you think will be the greatest benefits to the Met Police as a consequence of the new reform bill that's coming through?
So I think the benefits to policing I will answer it that way, and then how that sort of filters through to the Metropolitan Police. At the moment, we are working in a system where once things move away from the local, it immediately gets very complicated. So whether you're talking about international operations, whether you're talking about specialist functions, if you want a helicopter, you go to West Yorkshire. If you want ballistics intelligence, you send it to West Midlands. I mean, the whole thing is a sort of a Byzantine thing that's grown up over decades. That complexity is then mirrored on support areas. So policing, we've got 43 forces, separate technology functions, the acquisition of technology and equipment, so that slows it down and means it's not as advanced as possible. It means we're less integrated in terms of our data and intelligence than we would be. So all of that sits behind the shop window of local policing, which we've all spoken about so much of value, is more complex. So rationalising that has big benefits for the whole of policing, including for the policing of London. Now, part of the changes that in my mind are necessary and are talked to in the policing paper are having fewer police forces so that every local force is fully capable rather than needing so many collaborations. Clearly the Met isn't going to need to be bigger, but so that doesn't affect us in that way. But then having one national body rather than multiple national functions will help, and we have some national functions including counter-terrorism, so in due course, once we've established a secure national body, then there's potential for that and the National Crime Agency to go into those bodies. These are things you can't do quickly overnight. If you rush this in 18 months, you're taking very busy, complex national functions and treating them badly. But over a small number of years, form a national body, bring these functions together, it would be much better for policing. And it sort of picks up the previous point really in terms of local and national. If you've got a sensible number of local police forces and one national body, with the right balance of power between them, so then I think we can achieve a lot more than we are at the moment, where resources are tied up in this complex, knotty system that we've built over several decades.
Okay, and what do you think the disbenefits will be of the police reform bill?
I don't think there are disbenefits. I think there are risks if we do it wrong, though. I think if you did it badly, you could automatically create a system that pulls all the resources to the centre and nationally. If you did it badly, you could lose the support of all the good people in police organisations across the country if they can't see a path for themselves in the future in terms of their terms and conditions. If we do it badly, we won't enable ourselves to take advantage of the technology revolution on the journey. So there's things we need to take account of. But I think every challenge in policing points in this direction. I think one of the things we're going to think about on the way is performance and keeping a grip of day-to-day performance, but also I think we need in a police service which is squeezed for resources, a clearer agreement nationally on what the most important areas of police performance are will be helpful.
So you talked about how the Met is focused on tackling organised and serious organised criminal activity. What do you think the impacts will be if that's a national body overseeing that?
At the moment, we have a national body doing organised crime work, National Crime Agency. I don't see the intent in this that no organised crime work gets done in the local forces. You need some of the organised crime capability close to communities. So the work we've been doing, we've just been talking about around the mobile phone theft and how organised crime organised crime is driving some of that in London. You're better off doing that close to local policing. Conversely, some of the organised crime work that's linked to the gangs exporting internationally and requires working with Chinese or other governments, you want a national body that's going to help do that. So you need that capability at both levels, but heavily interoperable and working closely together. And I think that's entirely achievable. At the moment, we have effectively 3 tiers. In some forces across the country still have their own organised crime capability, some don't. Then you have regional level collaborations because some forces aren't big enough to hold it. Then you have national functions. So it gets very confusing. This is a more sustainable approach that we're talking about.
And so the implementation of the reforms, how do you think they will impact on policing as they come through the system?
So I think we shouldn't be under any illusion it's a big, complex change to do something like this. Creating new organisations, restructuring, this will require a tremendous determination and shared leadership from the Home Office and from police leaders working together to bring this to effect. It's not going to be straightforward, but the opposite is we just say, well, we stuck with the system we've got and we stay there because it's what we've got, regardless of the fact it's less and less fitted for today's world. And you will examine things here and probably have done around cybercrime, fraud, international organised crime, specialist capabilities policing needs, and none of these can be done well 43 times, and we're in this muddled setup with 43 local forces, I say, multiple national bodies. It's not the way to meet those challenges for today.
And so what are your views on the timescales that have been given for implementation?
I'm cited on some of the timescales the Home Office are discussing. I'm not sure they've been published, so I'm not sure that's for me to announce them. But I think getting on quickly with the first stages of a national body, that phasing it, building its skills over several years is the right approach there. But we need to do the changes to local policing in parallel with that because they all need to fit together.
So you told our predecessor committee that the responsibility for counter-terror coordination should stay within the Met. What's changed your view?
I said that about a decade ago. So that's about you've dug through your archives very effectively there. It was a slightly simpler world in terms of how terrorism was operating. B, it was in the context of discussions of simplistic changes to policing rather than a proper root and branch reform, which is what we're talking about now. And third, the pace of operations then at the middle of ISIS and all the things we were facing was very difficult. So there's a range of reasons then, but it's still within the Met. I've been in and out of the Met since then, but I think the state of the world now, the state of policing, it's getting more. We're getting more out of date, and we need to be set up for the future.
So you have some experience of the proposed reorganisation because you've reorganised yourself from 32 boroughs into 12 larger basic command units. What learnings could you advise other police forces on the work they've had to do to achieve this?
So it was the right change to make. It wasn't executed as well as it needs to be, and it's taken some follow-up interventions to get the system working. I think the key thing that we got wrong, there was not enough resource placed at the local level in neighbourhoods at the start of that. So that end of policing got devalued, and that was one of the areas that we were put into, engaged by the sort of special measures, so to speak, by the inspectorate. So the balance within the organisation was sucked too far towards the centre, and we've rebalanced that. So trying to run local policing 32 times in London, it was definitely the right decision to move away from that. some of those units were too small to meet all the challenges of today. So moving to sort of 10, 12 or 14 or something like that, we looked at different options, was definitely the right thing to do. Some of the implementation, in hindsight, you did it differently, but we've caught up with that and sort of the performance figures I spoke about earlier, and say things like having the lowest homicide rate in London, having less injury violence in London than other cities shows that it's working.
Come back to Joe, but Peter Prinsley just wants to come in quickly.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm sorry to be delayed. I'm Peter Prinsley. I'm the MP for Bury St Edmunds and Stowmarket. I'm just looking at this police reform white paper, and what I understand is that there's going to be a new strategy for recruiting graduates. Is that so? And how do you see recruitment changing and assisting with your endeavours? And are we recruiting the right sort of people into the police force right now?
So it's quite a broad statement in the paper. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think within the paper are several comments about a different workforce strategy for the future. I think it's instructive to look at the National Crime Agency, where they've got quite a different mix of people that come into that organisation from different routes, and that's worth seeing. In the Met, I helped start a sort of decade ago. We now bring people directly in as detectives, and that's been useful. There are certain people who see themselves as a detective career, but aren't so interested in sort of the uniform operations end of it, and that's brought different types of people into the organisation. I think it's still true that the majority of our people have degrees who join policing anyway. So it's a slightly old-fashioned notion that there aren't graduates in policing. There are plenty. I think there is scope for different accelerated promotion and routes into policing. I'm cautious about direct entry into operational leadership roles at a senior level, simply because the responsibility a frontline officer has is enormous. They have massive devolved authority. They're arresting people, they're investigating complex cases, they're making life-changing decisions. I think it's difficult to put someone in an operational leadership role over that if they haven't done it. And what we expect of operational leaders, it's a bit like it's like saying, I know, coming in direct entry as a consultant brain surgeon. I'd probably rather have someone myself who's worked their way towards that rather than somebody it was their first week. But we do have lots of senior leaders in policing who are part of the leadership, who are leading other functions like technology, and people who bring different skills in. And I have seen very powerful examples of good people coming in from adjacent sectors, from social services, from the National Crime Agency into policing, from intelligence agencies. So people who've got adjacent operational leadership skills is very valuable, not coming in from Sainsbury's.
I do want to try and get you out on time.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm answering too slowly.
No, that's fine, don't worry. I just want to make sure you've yeah.
So essentially, do you think that we are putting in sufficient resources into the training of our senior police officers?
No. Was that quick enough? No.
That's a perfect answer.
I did some... I made a promise when I started in the Met 3 years ago. We were going to try and give a week's leadership development to every leader each year. One of the things I had in my mind was a comparison. The military, after leaving Sandhurst, if say 15 years later you're a colonel and you're in charge of 1,500 people, the data I can recall from mine, you've done 72 weeks leadership development in that period. It's a very structured approach. When I look at the chief superintendents in the Met who maybe 15 years since they were an inspector, sort of comparable progression, most of them have had 2 or 3 if they're lucky. Now I think someone will criticise me this time, the military's a bit overindulgent, but I think we are skeletal on that and it's not acceptable. And successive governments have massively cut investment in national police training over the whole length of my career since the 90s. I think that's a big mistake, and I hope as reform we're able to rebuild that.
Let's move on to policing in protest. Joe White.
So you said that you on average police over 500 protests per year.
Yeah.
How does the law and public order provide your officers with the powers it needs to keep Londoners safe?
I think the law on public order, I'm looking for the tab with all my facts and figures in, excuse me. I think the law on public order is well out of date, and I'm encouraged that the Home Secretary has asked Lord Ken MacDonald to review sort of protest and hate crime legislation to see what changes can be made. I think the reason that is the case is the core of the Public Order Act around protest was written in the Public Order Act in the 1980s, a very, very different context. There have been tweaks and amendments multiple times since. Obviously, between sort of halfway between then and now, the Human Rights Act came in. So every protest-based policing decision, an officer has to consider the specifics of protest legislation and the generic principles of the Human Rights Act legislation, and find a balance between the two. We've seen so many cases where the decision the officer made as a command decision within maybe a day planning an event or on the ground during the event is then poured over all the way to the High Court or the Court of Appeal over subsequent years, examining whether those balances were right. That is not a fair position to put police officers into. So I think it's due a overhaul, and I hope Lord MacDonald finds that. We operate without fear or favour under the law. There is a lot of debate about our policing of protest. A lot of it seems to be based on what people hope the law might be rather than what it actually is. And we routinely find ourselves making a judgment in the middle of a situation about protest and counter-protest, where we're putting conditions on both of them to restrict the impacts on communities and restrict the risk of violence. And we'll find ourselves, people on this side of the sort of political or geopolitical argument will say you're favouring them, and people on this side of the argument will say you're favouring them. And I'm disappointed, frankly, that too often parliamentarians join that and add to that heat of everyone trying to push policing to be more in favour of their side. That's not our job. It's our job to be neutral and independent. I think the vast majority of what we've done over the last few years, I think we've got right. Occasionally you look at cases and think, actually, we could have been a bit more assertive there or a bit too assertive, but most of the time we've got it absolutely right. But it has been a very challenging operating environment for us. And for my officers on the ground, it's extraordinarily difficult when you've got people trying to catch you out, putting phones in your faces, trying to wind up officers. We had an officer have a pro-Palestine sticker stuck on his arm, get photographed, and then get death threats for supporting Palestine in the papers. We've had horrific things happen as people have been trying to use policing as a football, and that's been very difficult. But we will keep operating under the law as it is today without fear or favour.
So we recently met with the Greater Manchester Police, and they talked about the new phenomena of auditors in protests. And is this something that you are having to deal with in London, and is it requiring a new policing method?
Yeah, so yes, I mean we do the vast majority of protest policing, and so we get a lot of that. Clearly, I want to be careful that my answer doesn't imply something. I'll say something very clearly up front. If somebody wants to film something an officer's doing in the street, that's okay. We've got nothing to hide, but do it at a respectful distance. Don't try and telescope yourself into the situation and make it hard for the officer to deal with. That's the thing that is very difficult for officers. And auditors, so we've got protesters turning up and saying, I'm an auditor, as if it's some legal office, and therefore you can't deal with me as a protester. Well, you're still on this protest. Whether you've got a camera in your hand or not is irrelevant. And so that is another part of the challenge. And then they will put edited clips online to try and mispresent officers' action. So we've had to remodel our approach to social media and communications to try and get much more agile and dynamic to deal with that. Candidly, getting the facts very quickly in the middle of an operation is very difficult, but we've got much better at that and making more assertive, that's not true, we did this is why we did it, all those sorts of things, and putting out the whole video of an incident from an officer's body worn rather than the clipped one. But it's a great challenge for officers to be wrestling with. I've just got my numbers here. Yes, it's going to be north of 500 by the time we get to the end of this financial year. We're at 416 as we came into this year, and we're heading towards probably being about 75,000 shifts by the end of the financial year, which is probably total cost of that 40 or 50 million. And that's 40 or 50 million of policing that's not policing communities, the point Margaret made earlier.
We've only got a few minutes left, and we do want to cover off just policing of football, because we've obviously been doing some work on that. So Paul Kohler.
What approach would the Met have taken to the issues that arose in the Maccabee-Aston Villa game?
So clearly, I'm not here to speak for West Midlands, but you get any key report on policing, and obviously the sort of Chief Inspector of Constabulary did a pretty forensic review on what he thought had gone right and wrong in that case. So we have looked at that and taken a judgment on, is there anything that we can learn from this in terms of our approaches? We're confident the flow of intelligence, sort of proper auditing of intelligence from picking of information, how it flows through and influencing decisions. We're broadly happy with our processes on that. The way our commanders make decisions, the audit trails on that, how we oversee operational risk as a senior team, up to and including myself and the deputy. We're happy with how we do that. We have a pretty well established process for doing community impact assessments, but we've got some thoughts on some minor improvements to that. I think the critical issue, and I've discussed this with my command team, is about brutal operational clarity about policing purpose. If you are feeding information in on the basis of, is this sporting event safe to take place, your consideration has to be about the event and the spectators, not about wider issues. There's a safety of the event which I think stands on its own. There's a separate issue, of course, which is then the policing of that. If there are some people who object to the event taking place, then enabling it to do so might require some quite sizable policing. But separating those two things out, I think, is really, really important. There is something that my team have been working on, and one of my team leads nationally on some of the policing of major events. I think SAGs are overdue some reform. They don't really have a statutory basis. They're pretty variable across the country. I think some of them in some parts of the country end up being chaired by local politicians. I'm not sure that's a proper sort of operational meets policy separation. Some of this may be sortable by better guidance. I know that one of the national centres is working on that. But I do wonder whether they might need a legal basis at some point in the future.
How does the Met interact with SAGs?
So we, like other police force, in the sense of we're a part of SAGs, we're not generally chairing them, and we're feeding in our assessment based on the sort of intelligence about crime disorder. There'll be other considerations for a SAG, but we will feed in what we know and what our considerations are about crime disorder for that. I know that major concert, that sporting event, whatever else that would be. There is a difference I would make, picking up the point about protest. I think legally is important to separate out. On protest, we do take account of the community's view in a different way, because Parliament said we could put conditions on protest if it was going to have serious disruption to the life of the community. So you said to us, take account of the impact of protest on community. So in terms of us putting conditions on protest, we're not just looking at the protest itself, we're thinking about its impact on others. I think for a sporting event, if that is a lawful thing to happen, which, as long as it's safe, we should do everything we can do to enable that to do so.
Lastly, what is the Met saying to officers about the use of AI?
So we're using AI like every other organisation. We subscribe to the sort of national guidance on it in terms of ethical use of it. Clearly, the most critical thing in this is about the human in the loop and the quality assurance of what's going through and the processes you've got. So a sort of one simple example of high-end tech, our use of facial recognition, live facial recognition in the streets. Facial recognition doesn't decide somebody's going to get arrested. Facial recognition says, I've got a high degree of confidence that person who's walking past the van is that person who's been wanted for 3 years for rape. The officer stops that person, checks out whether that looks right to them, checks out potentially with a fingerprint in the street, and then makes the arrest decision. And in the we do an annual report to put all the data out there. 1,000, just shy of 1,000 arrests over the year reported up to September last year. About a third of them for violence against women and girls offences, people wanted for those. 3 million people walked past the vans in that period of time. 0.0003% error rate. That's 10 people. It said, I think that one's wanted when it was a mismatch. 4 of those weren't even stopped because it was obvious to the officer that it wasn't right. 6 were spoken to briefly and on the way. If you compare that to human error, that's far, far, far lower. It's far less intrusive than police normal operations. And whilst there's clever technology saying, we think you should speak to this person. Sorry, Peter, I didn't mean to point at you that way. We think you should speak to this person.
I'm always getting ready.
We think we should speak to this person. The officer is making the decision. I think that's the critical point.
Thank you very much. There's still obviously many, many things we could ask you, but I am very aware that you do have to go. So thank you again for coming. We will not leave it so long for you to get you back.
Thank you.
Particularly keen to hear about all the work you've been doing and the initiatives and to see how they're developing. But once again, thank you for your time. Order, order.
Thank you, Chair.